Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I want to talk to you about a very strange story coming out of Russia right now because, as we all know, Russia has a serious labour problem. The country is struggling to find enough workers to fill vacancies all across the economy. Construction companies don't have enough people to actually build things. The manufacturing businesses are all short. Farmers can't find enough labour to actually sow the seeds or actually reap the harvest, and restaurants can't find enough staff to serve people. And according to Russia's labour ministry, the country requires an additional 11 million workers by 2030. That's only 3.5 years away. Now, normally when a country faces a worker shortage, it will do everything possible to attract more workers. So it will encourage immigration, make it easier for skilled workers to move there, and try to increase labour participation. It will do everything it can to expand the available workforce. But Russia is moving in the opposite direction. At the same time as businesses are struggling to recruit staff, the Russian government has been tightening migration rules, increasing deportations, and making life more difficult for many of the migrant workers who've traditionally filled these jobs. And that raises an obvious question. Why would a country that desperately needs more workers make it harder for workers to stay and to come to the country? Well, that's what we're going to discuss in today's video. But before we get started, and if you're enjoying these videos, could I ask you to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button, please, the thumbs up button. It really helps me with the algorithm and also puts a smile on my face. And also, I wanted to remind you that my competition, where you come in my property or a cash alternative prize, is closing at 5 p.m. UK time on Friday the 12th of June. That's this Friday. So if you're overseas, if you're in New York, that will be midday. And if you're in Los Angeles, that will actually be 9 a.m. Friday. So basically for you, it's closing on Thursday. So you really don't have much time left. So if you're interested in buying a ticket, scan the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below. It will take you through to the independent company that's hosting the competition on my behalf. And good luck in the draw. Everybody's got an equal chance. Now let's get into the details. The first thing we need to understand is just how serious Russia's labour shortage has become. Russia has a population of around about 145 million. Well, it's actually going down on a daily basis, but let's call it 145 million. However, only around half of those people are actually involved in the workforce because you've got very young people and you've got a lot of older people. Russia's actually got an ageing population. And Russia's unemployment rate is currently sitting at around 2%, which is one of the lowest levels amongst the world's major economies. Now, normally politicians would love low unemployment figures because it suggests a booming economy. But that's not necessarily what's happening in Russia. The problem is that there aren't enough available workers. That's one of the reasons why unemployment is so low. Businesses are competing against each other for the same pool of labour. One factory tries to recruit from another factory. Construction companies are offering higher wages to get people to leave other businesses. Warehouse businesses are having to increase the salaries that they're paying. Restaurants are also having to pay top dollar to bring in people. So everybody's fighting over the same shrinking workforce. And one of the big problems is that the Kremlin has been employing lots of companies and people directly to support the war effort, this move to being a wartime economy. And that's really accentuated the shortage in people. And one of the problems with that increase in wages is that it creates inflation. But before we get into talking about inflation, let's look at why this problem has actually emerged. The biggest issue is demographics. Russia has one of the weakest demographic profiles amongst all of the major economies. Birth rates have been declining for decades, ever since the Soviet Union fell apart. We've seen a massive reduction in the birth rate. The fertility rate in Russia is currently around 1.4 children per woman, which is well below the replacement rate of 2.1. It has to be 2.1 because not every woman has a child, and obviously some people leave the country as well. So more people are leaving the workforce than entering it, and as a result, Russia's working age population has been gradually shrinking for years. For a long time, however, this problem was partially hidden by migrant labour. Millions of workers from countries such as Uzbekistan, Tajikistan and Kazakhstan travelled to Russia in search of higher wages and employment opportunities. These workers became essential for many sectors of the Russian economy, such as construction, agriculture, warehousing, transport, cleaning, hospitality. Many of the jobs that Russian workers were either unwilling or unable to fill instead was carried out by migrant labour. And for years that arrangement worked very well. Russian businesses gained access to workforce, and migrants earned significantly more in Russia than they would have at home. And billions of dollars were sent back to Central Asia every year in the form of remittances. That's basically how migration works. However, over the last few years, several events have combined to create the perfect storm for Russia. The first was the war in Ukraine. When Russia launched its invasion, hundreds of thousands of working-age men either joined the military, were mobilized into the armed forces, or left the country altogether. There was a mass exodus. Various estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of Russians emigrated. I've talked about it before. It potentially could be over 1 million people have left Russia since the start of the war as a direct result of the invasion. Not because they were worried about the war, more because they were worried about their own future, either because their companies had left Russia, or they didn't want to continue working in Russia under the sanctions, or they didn't want to be mobilized, they didn't want to be forced to have to go and fight in Ukraine. Many of those people leaving were educated professionals, engineers, IT specialists, managers, and entrepreneurs. Exactly the sort of people that any economy wants to retain, because they're the cream of the crop. At the same time, defense production began absorbing huge numbers of workers. Arms factories expanded to keep the war effort going, military suppliers increased their production, and recruitment bonuses for the military were increased, which was more attractive for people, and workers were drawn away from civilian industries. As a result, labour shortages became more severe. But then another major event occurred. In March 2024, the Crocus City Hall terrorist attack near Moscow killed more than 140 people. I don't know whether you remember that, but basically there were guys running around inside the hall shooting people. The suspects were citizens of Tajikistan, and the attack shocked the country and generated enormous political pressure on the government to strengthen migration controls. And the response was swift. Migration checks increased, registration requirements became stricter, enforcement activity intensified, deportations increased significantly, and employers faced additional administrative requirements, with regional governments beginning to introduce restrictions on migrant employment in certain sectors. So throughout 2025 and into 2026, further measures have been continued to be introduced. The Russian authorities argue that these policies are necessary to improve security, reduce illegal migration, and strengthen oversight of foreign workers. And every country has a legitimate right to manage its borders and address security concerns. However, from an economic perspective, the situation becomes much more complicated because the jobs haven't disappeared. The demand for workers is still there. Construction companies still need more builders. Farmers need more labourers. Warehouses need more staff. And restaurants need more kitchen porters and waiters. Factories still need production workers, and the economy requires people to perform all of these roles. And this is where the contradiction emerges. Russia says it needs millions more workers. It faces a severe labour shortage. It says businesses cannot recruit enough staff, and at the same time, it's making it harder for many migrant workers to enter and remain in the country. So those two positions don't really sit comfortably together. In fact, some reports are now suggesting that Russia is actively looking elsewhere for labour. So recruitment efforts have reportedly been expanded in countries such as India and parts of Asia as businesses attempt to fill their vacancies. And if you just think about that for a moment, Russia is simultaneously tightening migration controls while searching for more workers abroad. So that tells you just how severe the labour shortage has become. And there are real economic consequences here. When businesses can't recruit workers, wages rise. Now that sounds positive if you're a worker, because you're going to get paid more, but when wages go up and if those wage increases become excessive, businesses have to pass on that cost increase in terms of price increases, and of course price increases then increase inflation. And that's what Russia has been struggling with over the past few years. Inflation has remained stubbornly high, and the central bank has been forced to keep interest rates at elevated levels. which means that borrowing costs have increased, and that means investment becomes more expensive for companies, business expansion as a result slows, consumer spending then weakens, and economic growth comes under pressure. So in effect, labour shortages are now feeding directly into one of Russia's biggest economic challenges. What's particularly interesting here is that this is no longer simply a short-term problem. The demographic trends suggest the issue will persist for many years. Russia's own predictions suggest by 2030 they need 11 million more workers, which is a huge number. To put that into perspective, it's roughly equivalent to needing an entire additional workforce the size of a medium-sized European country. And the question here is, where exactly are those workers going to come from? The birth rate is not rising significantly, the population in Russia is aging, and the workforce is shrinking. And migration has now become a much more politically sensitive topic, which means the challenge isn't getting easier, it's actually getting much harder. And that's why this story matters, because this isn't really an immigration story, it's an economic story about demographics, about inflation, about labour markets, and it's a story about what happens when politics and economics start pulling in the opposite direction. The reality is that Russia faces several challenges simultaneously. It's got an ageing population, a declining birth rate, therefore a shrinking workforce, and the loss of workers through emigration because they're worried about the war. There's an ongoing diversion of workers into military service and the defence production because of the switch to the wartime economy, and the migration restrictions are further reducing that supply of labour. So none of these challenges are easy to solve individually. However, taken together, they represent one of the biggest long-term risks facing the Russian economy, because regardless of politics, ideology, government policy, every economy ultimately depends on its people, because people build houses, manufacture products, grow food, provide services, and therefore drive growth. And if you don't have enough people, sooner or later, the consequences begin to show. So hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already.